Well, thank you, Wayu. That's far too generous, and I'm very happy to be here. I know I have around 10 minutes, so I shortened the slide deck that I've begun presenting. I'm I'm an environmental economist, and I was born in Brazil. In Brazil, you eat a lot of meat if you can afford it, and obviously, I have a PhD. I'm a professor. I came from a family that had certain affluence, so I'm not going to deny that. And I used to eat a lot of meat. And not wanting to signal virtue, but in the past 5 years, I've stopped eating meat. And I think that I hope that people, we talked about history, right? History tells us that people can change over the decades. I know most people don't have the viewpoint that I do, but I think people can change. And I'm so happy that I don't eat meat. This is something that I feel very proud of. I know I'm signaling virtue, and it's not a good thing to do that, but I did want to share that piece of that personal note with you. So what I'm going to talk about today is work that I do research and teaching and service. These are the three pillars in the life of an academic. And what I'm going to tell you about today, I'm going to link two of the pillars, the research with the teaching. So I'm going to tell you about work that I've done with students, through students in different roles. So I think that's sort of the main point of my talk. I know there's a talk coming after me on carbon labeling, but I did want to kick off with, I won't do a quiz, I don't have enough time, but just to give you a sense of the carbon emissions that are embedded in different products that we consume frequently. So Olivia told us about carbon labeling already. So these are products that we consume in Singapore. When you take a 10-kilometer ride in a mid-sized petrol car, you summon a Grab to your door, that adds 2 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. Carbon dioxide equivalent is emissions of carbon dioxide which create climate change, but also other gases like methane and different gases. So these emissions that are happening as the product is delivered to you, they're the ones that create climate change, the greenhouse gas effect. Another product that we consume is electricity. So a 3-room HDB per day, that adds, so that's 10 kilowatt hours of electricity, and that adds 5 kilograms of CO2. How come it's not emitting in my house when I turn on the light? But again, that's natural gas that's coming from Indonesia. It's burned to generate electricity, so it's the whole life cycle of the product. One that speaks to this workshop is food, and Olivia mentioned that beef is through the roof. So beef is the animal protein that is the edible version of coal. Why is it so high in emissions? Definitely the transport, and as Olivia was mentioning. And one thing I also want to mention is beef comes from cattle, and cattle are ruminants. So they regurgitate methane, and methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. So 1 kilogram of bone-free beef, it adds, as Olivia mentioned, the astounding 25 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents. Okay. Air travel. So air travel is a product that we all love. So these are all products we love. This is not to say that we should not consume them, but this is to say that when we make these choices, there is this impact. So if you take a plane and go to London in the UK and back, in economy class, you're squeezed in economy class, that adds, we're not talking about kilograms now, we're talking about tons. It adds 3,000 kilograms, 3 tons of CO2 equivalent. How do you calculate this? You take the fuel that the plane will burn getting to London and back, and divide it by the space that each passenger takes. Okay, so that's 3 tons. And the king of all is this amazing product that is business class, a long-haul flight. We want to sleep and show off that we're in business class. So a passenger business class occupies 3 to 5 times the space of an economy passenger. Let's keep it at 3. So that's 9 tons of CO2e in business class. Now, why do I have this picture here? This is Penelope Cruz. She's the brand ambassador for Emirates Business Class. And the point I want to make is it's really hard to try and reduce your carbon intake because the whole system is geared towards a very high carbon lifestyle. Okay, we all want to, have this kind of lifestyle. It's a very natural thing that Penelope is selling to us through Emirates branding. Okay, so that's an introduction to carbon labeling. I'm going to have, yes, and then one thing I won't spend time on, but as an economist, we like thinking about damage and dollars and prices. And we do have a price in terms of damage, dollars of damage, for every 1 kilogram or 1 ton of carbon dioxide that we emit. Okay, there's a literature, scientific literature trying to get at that. And so you can go from masses, from quantities in kilograms of CO2 equivalent, to dollars of damage today and in the future. Okay, so when you fly business class, or let's say you fly economy class, you're adding $600 of climate damage. 1 kilogram of beef adds $5 of damage. Okay, and this is something that we don't price. We don't. When you buy beef, that's not in the price. Okay, and so that's the reason why what Olivia was mentioning, that it's so cheap to get beef flown in through Brazil and people are eating beef and chicken, is because our prices are incorrect. We're not pricing for the damage that our choices make. So in other words, these high carbon products, they're underpriced, if you want to think of it in terms of as an economist. So back to food. Why do food systems matter? Again, along the lines of the previous two talks. So something that my students are always impressed about, they don't have this notion that if you take global emissions, the food sector is around 1/4 of global emissions. Okay, people have the sense that food is natural. How can it be 1/4 of our climate damage? Another big impact of our food systems is the amount of space they take. So if you take away the tundra, frozen land, the remaining land that's habitable, agriculture today takes up 50%. And a lot of that is extensive farming at the frontier where we're cutting down forests. You've got low quality ranching, cattle ranching. So the way we eat today, the choices we make are exacerbating the twin climate and biodiversity challenges. Across the world, meat consumption is growing. And just like we talk about the energy transition, it's an imperative, we have the protein transition. Besides sustainability, which is the first point, what are what we call co-benefits, other benefits from trying to rethink our food system? So one of them is human health. We've talked a little about human health. I'll show you one point in a moment. But to the extent that we can move away from heavy meat consumption and eating more plants, there's research, increasingly good research showing that it's good for your health. Animal welfare, you might care about this. This is the type of book that we read to our children. There's a happy cow and a happy farm, and we know that's couldn't be further from the truth. We are, in a way, I've read these books to my kids a lot, so I'm not judging, but that's a lie, right? The animal farming is anything but happy. So to the extent that you care about these sentient mammals, that's another reason that you might want to move away from the type of food that we eat. Food security. So I noticed in Olivia's talk that one of the points is, I forget what the term was, but it was something about infections, right? Or something about, the big concern people have is about infectious disease. And there is increasing alarm by experts that the way we administer antibiotics so freely to people and also, very importantly, animals, to keep them tight in their industrial farms from getting disease, they don't have much genetic diversity, that antibiotic resistance might be a bigger killer than cancer in the not so far future. So when we think about foods and naturalness and ultra-processed, we could perhaps start saying that animal protein is ultra-processed because we're injecting antibiotics to them. So we have to think about the labeling. They're not that natural if we have to keep them where they are with so much antibiotics. Okay, so there's, I think, a lot of opportunity. Of course, it's a very big, would have a momentous effort to do that. Okay. Right, so I mentioned that there's work linking climate, the climate challenge, and personal health. Why does this matter? Because for most people, climate is something that they care about, but it's kind of far. I'm just one consumer. I'm one person. What can I do in the face of this huge challenge that is climate? It's not a very local problem. So if you can bring the benefits of eating more plants more locally to people, you might get more change. So this is a paper just pointing out and published in Nature that the way we eat matters for planetary health, but also matters for human health in terms of colon cancer, diabetes mellitus, and so on. So again, you might try and sell the protein transition not so much only with sustainability, but with human health. And that's some of the work I'll showcase in a moment. So at NUS, we have recently been awarded a big grant from the Bezos Earth Fund to set up a center for sustainable protein. We're very excited about that. If you look around the room, these are people from very different disciplines. So like Alvin, a food scientist, and like Wei Yu, a social scientist. So it's a really big challenge to think how we can eat differently over the next decades. Some very interesting comments at the launch of the center. I'll just say one of them, that since 1970, so this is 50 years, if you take the mass of human mammals, we've doubled that. If you take the mass of all other vertebrates, so not even mammals, that mass is halved. Okay, so there's a really big change happening. Right, so I'll talk a little about work I've done with my students in different roles. So I've had students as research assistants go out and survey people on campus, in shopping malls, about their understanding of the impacts of foods, both in terms of the planet, so thinking about carbon emissions, but also in terms of their health. And I focused on two attributes. One is the protein content of foods, and the other one is cholesterol, LDL cholesterol. There are many other attributes, but these are two that I thought would perhaps be more familiar to people. I've had students looking at the data that other students have collected and analyzing them in their course assignments. I've tested the carbon and food health literacy of my students before they take a course with me, after they take a course with me, to see if that has changed. Kind of an exam, but not, it's more formal and it's anonymous. And I've also tested whether the types of foods they eat after they've taken a course with me is different from what they ate before they took the course with me, okay? To see if they get understanding, but also if that translates into action. And I'm going to give you some very quick answers to what I've been finding, okay? So I don't really have much time, but I've administered these survey instruments. So here's one example that you approach someone on campus, in a shopping mall, Plaza Singapura. You talk a little about the concept of a carbon footprint, so the emissions from the farm all the way to the fork. And then you give them these different foods. They're all rich in protein. They don't know that, but they're all rich in protein, ranging from animals and beef. There's plants, like, for example, pinto beans, chickpeas. And then you show them a qualitative scale, but it's also quantitative. So it's a 7-point scale going from low to high, and that you ask them to choose the bubble that is what they think is the carbon content, the emissions content, or the climate damage of these different foods. So that's the planetary health aspect. The other one is the personal health. I also asked them about some other products that are not food related, but they're familiar with, like taking a Gojek, just as comparability. But then back to food, I asked them about their understanding of how much protein, adding across proteins. I know not all proteins are the same, but low, medium, and high for these different. These are all protein rich, by the way. The right answer would be high. And then cholesterol. Okay, so for example, fish would be high, but plants have no cholesterol. To see if they understand a few selected nutritional attributes of the foods. You can get the answers, you can grade them, just like we grade exams. You can grade them on an absolute scale. You can grade them you can give partial credit. So for example, you can give credit if people understand that beef is the highest in terms of emissions, if plants are the lowest in terms of emissions, you can give credit if, for example, they realize that chicken is 2 to 3 units in that 7-point scale, less carbon intensive than beef. So you don't have to just take the absolute responses, you can give partial credit. And what this does is you can then look at the distribution of carbon literacy and health, food health literacy in this population. So I'm going to give you 4 knowledge gaps that have come out in this data collection. And this is not only my analysis, but the analysis of, by now, maybe 100 students in my classroom poring over this data. Okay, so that's a very exciting thing, because it's actually the way I collect this data and bring it to the classroom. I'm also trying to teach people in something that's very local to them. So the first knowledge gap is people don't realize just how carbon intensive beef is. Okay, I think most people understand that driving it's high in emissions, but they don't realize that beef, so just to give you the numbers, 10 kilometers in a car is 2 kilograms of CO2. Okay, and 1 kilogram of beef is 25 kilograms of CO2. So 1 kilogram of beef is like driving 150 kilometers in a car, okay? People have no clue that it's so much higher. That's a big knowledge gap. And we think about beef as natural, right? But it's destroying nature. So that's a big opportunity for us in terms of messaging. And it's making antibiotic resistance a potentially bigger killer than cancer in the not distant future. Okay, so again, it's an opportunity. We're injecting antibiotics. Perhaps they're not so natural, if that's something people are looking for. The other knowledge gap is they realize that beef has more emissions than beans, but they understate the variation. They don't realize that. So this is something that I might want to point out. From beef to chicken, if you want to eat an animal in your meal, and that's a perfectly valid choice, but you want to do something your bit, from beef to chicken, that's an 80% reduction in the climate impact. Okay, not necessarily animal welfare, because you're still killing animals. And then from chicken to beans, that's another 80% reduction. Okay, and these are all protein rich. So I mentioned that you can grade, and there's a distribution. Some do better, some do worse, and then there's the mass in the middle. The other knowledge gap, I think, is talking about health, is there is around a quarter of the population that thinks that to get protein in your meal, you need to eat an animal. You cannot get by one meal without eating an animal and having protein. And that's not true. You can eat chickpeas, you can eat beans. Some plants are rich in protein. That's a potential selling point for the transition. And the fourth knowledge gap is fish and shrimp are perceived as low cholesterol and low carbon, just like they perceive chickpeas as low cholesterol. So that's another knowledge gap. Okay, you can test people's understanding of food health, so the attributes of food that speak to health, like for example nutrition, and then you can plot their understanding of the planetary health impact of food and their own health. There's a correlation. So I think I'm going to spend a moment on this slide and then I'll finish. So this is a question for you. Who is more carbon literate? Students who study environment or the general population? Who understands more about the climate damage of their choices? Correct. Okay, so environmental students are more carbon literate. Environmental students or the campus community, which is also quite educated? Correct. Okay, environmental students. The general population and the rest of our campus, okay, are indistinguishable. Okay, highly educated versus light educated. I think that's an obvious one, right? So highly educated have a better understanding of the climate impact of foods. And I was very relieved to learn that my students, after they've taken my course versus before, they have learned, okay? They have improved their understanding of the climate impact. Okay, you can do something similar with food health. one other thing I want to point out is I did this experiment where I gave a course to 111 students in environmental economics. These are not economists. These are from across the university, but it's about environments and economics. And key themes in my course were carbon, the climate impact of products, how consumers could be given information on their consumption and how that maps into climate. I talked about pricing. And what I did was I invited these students, once they had finished taking the course with me and they were no longer my students, I invited them to share with me their transaction reports by downloading from Foodpanda, Deliveroo, GrabFood, their orders for the last 180 days. Okay, and the great thing is that when they do that, I can look back to before they started taking the course, what they were eating. And I did that one or 2 months after I gave the course. So I can have a after versus before to see if their training in the climate damage of foods had any impact on their orders. Okay. We also, this is more technical, but you also want to have a control, people who did not take my course, to see if they've changed their orders. So I had a very high participation rate. They're my students. They were happy to say, sure, I'll participate. Obviously, this is all anonymized. It's not about the person, but about someone like that person. And they shared their orders. So these are examples. So this student ordered Big Mac, and there's beef here. This other student ordered from Ruyi and chicken rice. There's chicken. And so I can classify the type of proteins that my students are ordering after they've taken my course relative to before, compared to control that did not take my course, okay, to see if there's any impact. And I've run out of time, but I want to ask you 2 questions. I've got this in slides. So let's not think about the after versus before. Just let's compare students of environmental studies versus non-environmental studies students. Okay? Which of these groups eats more beef and chicken? So do their foods have less impact than the control because they take environmental studies? The answer is no. Okay? They actually eat more beef and chicken. Okay? Maybe they're more affluent. Okay? But they don't. Okay? So students of environmental studies, 19% of their orders have beef. Okay? And those who don't take environmental studies, 9%. Okay, so there's lots of limitations in the study, but that's coming out in the data. All right, and then the other question for you is, after taking my course versus before, do people reduce their consumption of beef towards chicken, and do they reduce their consumption of chicken towards vegetarian meals? Did I have any impact, at least in this short term? And the answer is, thank you, Olivia, but the answer is no. There's no impact. Okay, so they did understand, but at least in the short run, my hope is that over their lifetime, they'll make more connections. Okay, so there are lots of limitations. There's no judgment here. I'm not judging people. Okay, who am I to judge with my lifestyle until I'm to this day? Okay, but yeah, and environmental students, they take more Grab and Gojek rides than non-environmental students. Maybe it's an income effect. Okay, so I've run out of time, but just to wrap up, in social sciences, when we educate people, and maybe even introduce some pricing, we know that changes are going to be very small, 1%, 2%. So nudging with incentives, it has very limited effect. That's the short-run effect. Okay, so that's something to perhaps feel depressed about. Okay, but I like to take a longer view, which is, at the end of the day, politicians, they need to win elections. They're career people, just like in my career, I care about my incentives and my success. We all do that. So politicians respond to the public. And only when the public has understanding of risk, and that's the research institute that Olivia works in, public understanding of risk, only when they understand and they are educated will politicians respond with better policies. Okay, so I think that educating, even if you don't see immediate changes in consumption, I mean, that's the small, short-run thing. But there's a bigger point, which is it's very important to create climate literate citizens who understand the problem, understand that we're all in this together, that we have all these supply chains because there's pull from consumers. Only then might politicians respond with policies that help us get through this big challenge. The other big takeaway is climate is not a big seller. Okay, I realize that. Every 10 times I would like to say something in a social circle, I bite my tongue 9 times because I know that as a climate warrior, I'm a killjoy. You know, oh gosh, this guy again, reminding me of all these problems, right? So you don't want to sell climate. You don't want to oversell that as a thing. So we have to look for ways to make these lower climate damaging choices more local to people. And I think in food, that's a really big thing. I think there's a lot of misclassification, misunderstanding. We think about cattle as being natural, and there's a lot of opportunity for us to improve in that respect. And I think that's what the workshop is about. I think I totally blew my time, but thank you very much for bearing with me.